Hi, and thanks for joining us for the Well Bible Reading Podcast, episode number 50. Hard to believe it's almost been a year that we've been doing this. Thank you for joining with us and being a part of this journey in diving into God's Word and learning more from Him each week. Now, this week we are in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy chapters 19, 20, and 21, Psalm chapter 49, and in the New Testament we're in Luke chapter 5. We've got a lot to cover. So let's dig right in. Let me ask Amber and Craig to join us. Amber and Craig, thanks for joining us.
Hey, hey.
Howdy.
Yeah, thanks for all your study done this week. There's just a lot of stuff here, so we want to jump right in. Yeah, so Deuteronomy chapter 19, 20, and 21 is really, to some degree, an explication of part of the Decalogue, right? The Ten Commandments, starting with thou shalt not kill. So, and really the sanctity of human life in general, the sanctity of life, the sanctity of relationships. You see it all in these three chapters. These chapters may seem a little, I don't know, repetitious or boring to you in some ways, but there's a lot of rich material in here. We don't want you to miss it because what he's doing is he's expanding on the Old Testament law, in particular, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, which remember were the basis for all the law. All of the law flowed from those 10 commandments, and we're seeing it here as he's going over them again and just takes a deeper dive into the idea of taking life, of honoring life, of valuing life. So let's start there in Deuteronomy chapter 19, where he's talking about, the protection of innocent life, cities of refuge for those who accidentally kill, trying to draw a distinction, a subtle and fine distinction, sometimes hard to really tell what the difference is, but between premeditated, intentional murder and accidentally killing someone or something, right? So, is that what you guys got from there?
Yeah, I definitely did. Kind of in the first 13 verses of chapter 19, around the cities of refuge, it, it's an interesting way to approach the problem of how do you provide some channel for justice to be pursued while being fair to the, maybe the person that committed the murder but didn't intend to, but they weren't sure, right? You got to have some fair environment or atmosphere, kind of separate from the place where the passion of the act took place and where some of the rage of the relatives of the person murdered would have been inflamed. And so this gives separation of time and space, right? The person who committed the deed can go and seek refuge in one of these cities, and then the people that are pursuing justice can go to the city and plead their case. So this gives a forum where there's not prisons, there's not sheriffs and constables to go out and execute search warrants and hold the accused in a county jail while we wait for a trial court to open up and get it on the docket. They didn't have any of that infrastructure, right? So this is a way in a desert community that of people that were just coming into the promised land in the ancient world could have these principles in place in a time and a place of their own context.
Yeah, yeah. And what you see him doing here, it's really clear that so in the Decalogue he has thou shalt not kill. Well, that's great. It's a general principle. But now he's dealing with real life. So in real life situations, it's not always as easy as that, right? It
Right.
wouldn't it be nice if it were that easy? But there are extenuating circumstances. There are things that happen accidentally. There are nuances to thou shalt not kill. It's just not that black and white, right?
Yeah. I love that
I
I love
Go
that
ahead.
God gives us some real life examples to let us know that we do have to use our judgment, and we can't just, it's not like on the internet on Twitter where you say it in 100 what is it, 126 whatever it is characters, and you're done. It
Yeah,
takes thought and discernment and working as a community to get to the answer.
yeah,
Yeah, you see all these little case studies, and they're there to help us kinda look at these real life scenarios, but we're supposed to be able to adapt them to our own scenario. So, like, you can take any of these in the next several chapters. They're all these little case studies, and we can plug in any combination, even in our real world today, and get a similar result to what Moses and what ultimately God is wanting from them. As we entered into these refuge cities, I went back to Numbers where these were originally introduced, just a refresher of my mind. And I think we mentioned this, that these refuge cities really represent Jesus in a lot of ways. And I wrote down just five quick things that maybe to refresh our memory is both these refuge cities as a picture of Jesus are these things. Both are a easy place to reach. If you notice, it keeps talking about it's in the middle. They're in the middle. Basically, they're supposed to be easily accessible um, for anyone to get to. That's the first one. Second one, they both are open to all. This is not just for Israelites. If you look back in Numbers, it specifically says that anyone
Mhm.
is welcome, Gentiles, anyone that's welcome that needs a safe place, not just Israelite, just like Jesus. And the next one is that they become a place where they live. Like you just don't come to a refuge city just to look around, just to tour
Mhm.
around. That's not that kind of place. When you come to refuge city, just like when you come to Jesus, you come there to live, and that's it's Jesus is open for that.
Mhm.
Um, they both um, they fully freedom comes both refuge cities and with Jesus, both freedom comes with the death of the high priest. You see that in Numbers 35:25, which I thought was really interesting to kind of summarize all that. And the last thing I noticed with these refuge cities, if you look closer down to verse 7, it talks about these three extra cities. I've never noticed this before. It's
Mhm.
almost as if there was these three extra cities that would have been set up if they were to keep expanding, but, it seems like Israel never gets a chance to establish these because they continue basically, they continue disobedience. And
Mhm.
so my brain was wondering, Ellis, maybe this is just a throw it out into the universe question.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think very often that in scripture, something that's gonna be said this way, especially with God and that's just gonna be out there, it's not gonna be fulfilled. It's odd that this is on here. I'm wondering if it might be fulfilled with the establishment of the when the Messiah comes, that these
Mhm.
3 cities that were talked about here, who were never established because of disobedience, might be established later.
Yeah, God has a way of making it happen in spite of us,
That's right.
and Jesus obviously is the ultimate city of refuge and encompasses all those things. I love those analogies that you've made, Amber, from cities of refuge to Jesus. I'm telling you, that'll preach. It's really,
Mhm.
really, really good stuff. At the end of this chapter, where he talks about the witnesses, due process of law, rules of evidence, right, in having establishing credible witnesses, and we can talk about that. That could you could be addressing there the thou shalt not bear false witness, the lying thing, right? But here also is an instance where, in some ways, lying can be killing, because lying in the court where someone would say is going to get the death penalty and you lie about them, your lying just killed them in a real sense. And so here he's talking about lying as a an act of murder, really, in this particular situation, and also just kind of limiting to Craig's point earlier about this was kind of like the wild wild west. There just were not the kind of rules, the kind of systems in place, right, to protect the innocent who were falsely accused or who may be circumstantial evidence against them. And it was real easy for revenge, for vengeance, when it was your family member who was killed. Okay, the Old Testament law, in a sense, releases me to go kill, to go take revenge, right? And this is saying, no, no, no. Here at the very end of chapter 19, you have what is known as the lex talionis, the law of retaliation, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which was actually a limiting law, right? Is that what you guys see?
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's a limiting law of in Hannibal's time, and they had his law code. He put on some restrictions of going after those that have committed wrong against you, in a sense for revenge. He put some limits on that, but God and with his Israelites comes in and puts an even stronger limitation of proportionality and equitable treatment. And this is really, we would say, well, maybe equitable treatment in the literal sense of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth seems harsh for us today, but the Hebrews are real people in a real point of time and a real geographical place in history, and they're dealing with the world as it is around them. And this is a huge leap forward. This is a huge leap forward for justice,
Yes.
and God giving us a principle that is still that we still need to honor today. We don't need to have the exact laws that were implemented in Jewish society as they went into Israel, but we need to take the principles out of these laws and apply them to our own context, our own time. And there's this really important law of equitable treatment and justness that we need to apply to our own laws. And sometimes we don't get it right. So before we cast stones against the Israelite society's laws, the Old Testament laws. We need to take a hard look at our own, look at what they got right, and apply it into our own context.
Yes, yes. I mean, you have to remember in an age where it was basically almost like mafia style. You kill my brother, I go and I kill your brother, your sister, your family, burn down your house, kill your dog. That's revenge, vengeance. And this is saying, no, 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 no. You can't do that. It's one for one. It has to be equitable. The punishment has to fit the crime, right? You can't go over and aboard. And so it really was very progressive, to your point, Craig, for its day.
And right before that, it gives you the why. It says, "So you shall purge the evil from your midst." And
Hmm.
that's that same language we keeps hearing. God, Moses keeps saying, Yahweh is going to be in your midst. He's going to be in there. He's going to be there. It's like he is the tree of life once again in this new garden place. This desert's going to become a new garden, and Yahweh's in the midst. There's no room for evil here. Evil cannot be in your midst because Yahweh is supposed to be. And so that's the why. It's telling you very specifically why.
Yeah. So back to, in the New Testament, James, where he says that God can in no way be tempted by evil. Is as far as from the east to the west, God is away from evil and that kind of thing. He can't have anything to do with that. Yeah. And in chapter 20, we kind of keep the same theme going with the idea of holy war. So the obvious question then, thou shalt not kill, would be, well, what about in war? What about when you're in war against them? There, and war, hand to hand combat war was very, very common in that era, in that day and time. Tribal wars were happening all the time, fighting over territory and so forth. And so, are we allowed to kill in war? And he kind of starts to kind of lay that out, doesn't he? And even in that situation, he puts limits. It's
Yeah,
actually pretty progressive, right?
yeah, just even the fact that the Israelites were commanded by God to offer peace terms to cities before attacking them in verse 10 was hugely progressive. I mean, I don't know if they're the first ones to have that perspective, but they had to be one of the first ones in what was a very barbaric age of empire building and people groups
Mhm.
coming in from the east, coming into that Mesopotamian region. A lot of Asiatic tribes would come in and into Europe also, but definitely into the Fertile Crescent where there was a lot of rich soil and rivers around the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in that region. And of
Right.
course, push into the western side against the Mediterranean Sea and into Egypt. That was really lush territory, rich territory that was coveted by a lot of people groups. So just
Yeah.
saying that as they attacked and people washed in, offering peace terms like this was probably unheard of.
Yeah, it was
I
probably they may not have invented it, but they were one of the first to codify it to make sure that it was part of their law.
Yeah, I wrote down that it's interesting. This is the first time these regulations of like how to contract war is actually written down. We don't see it anywhere else. But oddly enough, if you go back to Genesis 14, it seems like Abraham, this is exactly how he went about his business when he was rescuing Lot. I mean, almost exactly. And so if you go back and read Genesis 14, I went back and read it. It's almost like Abraham was following the law before there was law. I mean,
Mhm.
before the Torah was the Torah, Abraham was doing these very things. It just tells you how what it meant for him to when it says that he walked with God. It's because
Mhm.
he says he walked with God because he knew these things before it was ever even written down. Before
Yeah.
these things were written down, I think it's beautiful. I would go encourage people to go back and see
The-
how Abraham handled these same issues.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's diplomacy before war, and
Yeah.
and it's a real strong theme through there. Craig, you had something?
yeah, I was going to say back to Amber's point, it's almost like these are first principles of life that come from God. That they're laws, yes, but they embody what those first principles are that come from God's heart
Yeah.
about how we live and treat each other.
Yeah, and then there's this piece even there when you verse 19, when you lay siege to a city for a long time, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them. Of course, I'm sure Amber loves that part because we're saving the trees, and
Save the
she like
trees.
save the trees. But it's a sense of the sanctity of all life that's part of creation, but also a really mandate against or a condemnation of scorched earth, a mentality or strategy in warfare. It's an ancient strategy where basically you're losing whatever. Just if it's taking too long and you just kind of scorch earth, you just destroy everything in sight, right? And he says, don't do that. Don't do that. What did the trees do to you? What are the trees that It's really interesting that he does that.
Yeah, I mean, trees throughout the Old Testament is all about blessing. To be fruitful and multiply didn't just mean your own family was be fruitful, multiply, but the things around you were multiplying, right? Including
Mhm.
the trees. You have ability to eat and to be blessed. And so
Yeah,
for them to not cut down the trees was another way of God sustaining their blessing that's to come into the promised land. They're
mhm.
entering the promised land. Let's not cut down your blessing. I put it there and let God bless you through it. So I think it's just a protection of what it looks like to be in a garden place. There's needs to be trees in this garden, y'all.
Absolutely, and you can really see where they're longing for the Garden of Eden. There weren't a lot of trees in the Holy Land. It was a lot of barren rock, a lot of wilderness, and this wilderness is not necessarily a Sahara. Don't think Sahara Desert. This is
Mhm.
barren rock, no trees, no real vegetation life. So you wanted to preserve what little you had, and so it was really this whole mandate from Genesis to take care of the earth, right? It's
Right.
a bottom line. It's not that we worship trees or we worship creation. We don't worship mother nature, none of that kind of thing. It's just a simple mandate that we're supposed to take care of the creation that God has given us and not use it as a weapon against our enemy, right? To burn it down. Yeah, that's excellent.
Part of our call to be tender, to tend the garden,
Yes,
be
there you go.
gardeners.
Tend the
And
garden.
and before we leave this chapter, I want to call attention to a quote from Christopher Wright, a theologian on the Old Testament. He has a really good book called Old Testament Ethics and focuses a lot on Deuteronomy. Uh, but just a real quick quote from him, which I thought was revealing. Without a Geneva Convention, Deuteronomy advocates humane exemptions from combat, requires prior negotiation, prefers nonviolence, limits the treatment of subject populations, allows for the execution of male combatants only, demands humane and dignified treatment of female captives, and assists on ecological restraint. So before, 3,000 years before our own Geneva Convention and our own sense of
Yeah.
maybe we should put some rules around the way we conduct war, Deuteronomy and God is doing that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And probably the Geneva Convention, a lot of it was actually based on these basic principles.
Good
And to
point.
Amber's point, they go all the way back to Abraham. Abraham was already obeying the law, or his values serve as a foundation, I would say, for the Mosaic law, and you see it in him. Chapter 21 goes into atonement for the unsolved murder. What do you do when it's a murder? You find someone dead, you can't solve it, right? And it really plays to this the responsibility of the community, doesn't it? The
It does.
responsibility of the community. It has certain rights for marrying a captive woman, where this is a woman who was a part of another culture, another group, but she's been captive in this war, and a man, an Israelite, falls in love with her. Can he marry her? What are her rights?
Mhm.
So it protects her rights as well in that also, right?
Yep. And then 15 through 17, when we talk about the rights of the firstborn son of an unloved wife, maybe an extension of the verses around how to treat female captives in these unloved wife scenarios. This is an interesting compare and contrast. They've codified you can't have favorites here, and you have to follow the kind of the
Yeah,
first law. The firstborn is the one that gets the inheritance because that's in line with Israelite society as it developed. The
yeah.
firstborn took on the responsibility of caring for the family and the siblings and the cousins and the offspring. So they
Well,
got the inheritance. But here's a compare and contrast to how uh, Jacob treated Reuben and
yeah.
Joseph and Genesis, as well as maybe a callback to Isaac and Ishmael's story. So I don't know if this is a correction or those were just Genesis cases where what God was doing to carry forward the story. But I
Oh,
found that
yeah,
sense.
very much a corrective to, hey, don't be like Jacob in this way, right? Where he played favorites, he had a favorite wife, and so forth, and so no, you have to. Firstborn is a firstborn, right? So yeah, that's excellent, and also just really, I want you guys to see too how progressive this was, because I think the Old Testament gets a bad rap on women's issues and how women were treated, and even some harsh critics would say misogynistic and so forth. But you have to understand that in its day and time, this was absolutely revolutionary and progressive for women. Just even mentioning what kind of rights they have and how you're supposed to be treated, and even captive women, even for it was progressive for the foreigner too, how the foreigner was to be treated. And the foundation for all that, God tells us several times, is because you were once foreigners, you were once captives, you were once slaves.
Yeah.
So don't forget what that feels like, right? Don't forget what it means to live like that. So the whole ethic is built on their own experiences in Israel, both the good and the negative, right? Yeah. Do you guys have anything else on Deuteronomy before we move away from there?
Just the another tree. I mean, no big deal. I like trees. The at the very end of 21, it talks about how the person should not hang on a tree overnight. They should be taken down and buried properly because it's a curse for a man to be on a tree. I just want to point out the obvious is that really points us to Jesus and one
Yeah,
of the reasons why they took him down as quickly as they did and didn't let him hang there longer. But also, I think one of the things I wanted to point out with this verse is that just like we talked about a minute ago, with the trees equal blessing, just like in Genesis. So remember, Genesis and Deuteronomy are supposed to be these mirrored images of each other. And Genesis is filled, packed. If you go back and listen to our first several episodes, filled with blessing and curse, blessing and curse, blessing and curse language. We're going to get this very, very soon in Deuteronomy. We're going to get fulfilled like so much blessing and curse language, but it starts right here. The trees are supposed to be blessing, just like they were in Eden. But because of our fall, you had these curse. So what God established as a tree to be a blessing and bring fruit for the humans to eat from, to be hung on a tree is a curse, and that's because of our fall and because what our human condition has done. And so this is comparing that blessing and curse. I just want you to be aware that in the next couple weeks, we're going to get a lot of blessing and curse language.
yeah. No, that's good. That's good. That's a direct, obviously, pointer to what happened with Jesus on the cross.
Mhm.
And to your point, Amber, the Romans actually would leave the bodies on the cross when they crucified. They would leave them on for days, weeks. There are actually very few, archaeologically speaking. They found very few evidence of archaeological evidence of crucifixion. Why haven't they found someone who was like nailed to a cross? Because the animals would come tear them off. The beast would come and eat them off the cross, and so it was really a brutal thing. The Romans had perfected that, but here the Hebrews were adamant that you don't do that, even to your enemies, even to the worst kind of vile criminal which crucifixion was reserved for the worst kind of criminals, right? Even they have there's a certain dignity a certain sanctity even to those lives, and a certain dignity that you take them off the cross, you don't leave them there, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's just saying you see that difference in the cultures, right? The Roman culture very much a culture of violence, and the Hebrew culture a culture of peace. Okay, so let's go to Luke chapter 5 then. Luke chapter 5. Y'all can read Psalm 49, great psalm. But here we have a lot built in here, of course. It's the calling of the disciples, and really a description of the beginnings or of Jesus's Galilean ministry, right? So Jesus is in Galilee now, and he begins calling his disciples, and he's calling this. This is an interesting one with Peter, right? Where first one he calls is Peter. So what do you guys? What did you get from there? Let's talk about Luke 5.
Yeah, so he calls them to cast out his nets on the waters and get a bunch of fish. And Peter's like, "Well, I'm the expert here, and I've been fishing all day the way I know a professional fisherman should. But yeah, stranger, based on your word, sure, I'll do that." That's the kind of mental image I get.
Yeah,
But he does, and lo and behold, the nets break.
yeah. Jesus is a tecton. He's a craftsman. He's a carpenter. We use the word carpenter. Not a fisherman, right? He didn't grow up around water. Where Jesus lived or grew up, that there's no water, not this kind of water. So
Yeah,
yeah, you
Yeah.
wouldn't expect him to be the expert.
Yeah, Peter could have easily been like, I worked all night and I'm tired, so no. Or I
Yeah,
know a lot more about fishing than you do. You're a carpenter. Or
right.
the best fish are at night. It's daytime now. What are you thinking?
Yeah,
There's all these things he could have said. And so I think we give Peter maybe a bad rap, but I think he just being like, we were there all night. I mean, he could have been like, I just washed my nets. I'm not going to get them dirty again. Right.
right.
No, he doesn't do that. He says, okay. I just
Yeah,
love that. I think we give him a little bit of a bad rap, but he was so willing to do it.
yeah,
Yeah, he
yeah,
doesn't give him much. Don't give him too my kids give me much more trouble than that.
and
yeah,
then what does he do in response? He falls on his knees and says, "I'm a sinner," and Jesus is like, "Okay, now I'll make you fishers of men."
Yeah,
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like, I'm calling you to work. I'm going to deal with your sins, but we got to get to work. So let's go.
Yeah,
And then kind of to illustrate that, we have the healing of the paralytic in the next scene, that Jesus is going to forgive the paralytic sin just like he forgave Peter's. And this is when he heals, this is what that looks like. This is a physical manifestation of how I'm healing and making straight, how I'm putting back together what was broken spiritually.
Yeah, and in Peter, we almost have a mosaic response where oh, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. He saw Jesus's miraculous power. Now, Peter already knew Jesus. This is the Galilean ministry. Peter met Jesus in the Judean ministry under John the Baptist. Peter was a disciple of John, as was his brother Andrew, and his brother Andrew introduced him, of course, to Jesus in the Judean ministry. Now they're moved up into the Galilean ministry, so here he knows that Jesus who he is, but he sees this power manifested, and he realizes I'm not worthy of you, right? I'm not worthy, and Jesus says that's right. That's exactly who Jesus wants. The person who says I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. Jesus says, okay, I can use you. The person who's saying, oh, I'm great, I'm wonderful, you need me, Jesus. Jesus can't work with you, right? He needs this material, this humility, and this repentant kind of material to work with. And here he finds it in Peter. And of course, we know the rest of Peter's story, and we love Peter and the way that he was just he just ran into things and was just so ready to try things. But it's interesting to me. He says here, uh, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." And Jesus' response is, "Don't be afraid, right? Don't
Yeah.
be afraid. Don't let fear keep you from following Jesus. Don't let fear keep you from doing things. Don't let fear should not inform your decisions, right? There's no place for fear. John says later, perfect love drives out fear, right? The love of God drives out fear. So I thought that was interesting. Don't be afraid, and He's going to make
It's
them into fishers of men.
It's interesting. Two things I noticed. One, he calls him master at first. This is a unique term that's only found here in Luke, and it's only used 7 times. And every time it's used to address Jesus. It's a unique word in the Greek. I couldn't tell you anything about it. I don't know Greek, but I just found that information. And then, but 3 verse later, he calls him Lord. He calls him this unique word, master. And then later, he's like Lord. Like he changed so quickly when he saw that. And then
Mm,
also this idea of catching men. As I was reflecting on that, I mean, I've heard it for years, but as I'm reflecting on it, I was like, what does that really mean to catch men? And it dawned on me that this catch applies something's alive. To catch something means with nets, it's still alive.
mhm,
And in my mind is the first time I've connected the opposite of what the enemy does. The enemy is used to as a lure. Like, and when you get hooked by a lure, that
mhm,
causes death. When you
mm.
get hooked with Jesus in his nets, I want to be caught in nets with Jesus. I want to be caught in his nets and alive versus I hope that makes sense. But for the first time, I'd never
Yeah,
really put those two pieces together before until this week.
If I
right.
can extend that a little bit, because I think that's a brilliant analogy. In this chapter, the nets break, but in John 21, when Jesus tells them to cast out their nets, the nets don't break.
Mm. Yeah,
I think
good.
Yeah.
there's something new going on there, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it goes right into once Peter's joined him, and now he's gathering these disciples. He goes into a couple of two scenes of miracles. The first is the man with leprosy, unclean. The idea of being unclean, and there's a little bit of a messianic secret in there. He says, "Don't tell anyone," right?
Mhm.
Don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest. And then the healing of the paralytic, where the friends bring. Of course, I love this story. A lot of people do. The friends bring their friend to Jesus. They dig through the roof, right, and to lower him there at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus has this confrontation with the Pharisees about forgiveness of sins. Which is easier, to forgive sins or to heal? I'll do both, right?
Right.
And so, but one of the things I love about that scene is that it's actually the faith of the friends that healed him. It says when he saw their faith, he healed the man, and just the importance of community and the importance of having friends who have faith, and friends who sometimes when your faith is weak, your friends lift you up and they strengthen your faith, right? So what did you guys get out of those two healings?
On the paralytic side, the response I find interesting from the Pharisees. They know that only God can heal sins, and so we see their eyes waking up to the threat from their perspective, the threat that Jesus poses and what he's really saying.
Hmm.
He's claiming to be God.
Oh yeah, it's craziness to them. That's like anathema to
Fascinating.
them
Yeah.
for
And
him to
so what
claim.
we have here is more temple imagery because that Luke wants us to get across. Because the whole point of the temple in the Old Testament was to deal with people's sins so that they could be in the presence of God. The healing sins in the Old Testament isn't about people going to where God is. It's about so that God can have a place to come live and tabernacle with his people, as Amber has been pointing out all along.
Mhm.
Here we have Jesus doing temple things and dealing with the sins of God's people.
Speaking of
Yeah.
temple things, that's the question I had. I had a big question mark after he cleanses the leper. He tells him to go to the priest, and it says, "Go to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing, as Moses commanded." Which I was like, "Oh yay, Old Testament connection." Commanded for proof to them. Ellis, help me explain that. If Jesus heals you, do you need to go to a priest and be cleansed by the priest? Help me understand why Jesus would send him there.
Yeah. No, because in that day and time, you weren't officially healed until the priest said you were. So there was leprosy, in this case, leprosy, which was any kind of skin disease. It was basically to put this step to just this stamp of approval proof that it was a true healing, that you were healed. And that's one thing. The other thing is that to go back for them to enter back into the community. Jesus saying, "Go show yourself to the priest," was his call for them to go back into their community and to make a difference in the community. They couldn't go back into their community or into their village until the priest approved of the healing. Once the priest said, "Yeah, the leprosy is gone," that's when they could enter back in.
And that's
So
when we
yeah.
enter back into Leviticus and all those rules of how long they stay
Mhm,
out of the town and they come
mhm.
into the town.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah, it has to do with all that.
Mhm.
Jesus is wanting them to go back into their village so they can have an impact on the village, right? Otherwise, they have to if they don't get the priest's approval, they have to stay out in the leper colony, so to speak, in isolation. So this material really of these two healings is kind of a bridge between callings. So we have the calling of Peter, then we have these two miraculous healings, both of them having to do with forgiveness of sins, with cleansing, and then you have the calling of Levi. And here, because so in the healing of the leper, you have someone who's obviously unclean, right? And the paralytic, you have this confrontation with the Pharisees. And with Levi, another confrontation with the Pharisees, because here you have someone who's a tax collector. He's part of the Roman system. He's a traitor to his people. He's considered unclean because he's doing that. And then then as soon as he accepts Jesus and becomes a disciple, he invites all of his unclean friends, right,
Mhm.
for a party that Jesus is there. And that's where Jesus gets attacked. So you kind of have all this connection with the idea that's going to build and going to be there the whole time: clean, unclean, sinners, tax collectors, all these things that Jesus is doing. So what did you guys get? So that piece with the calling of Levi is really a great scene. What did you guys get from that?
I had all kinds of visions of parables of the lost sheep and lost coin, but more to the point of the prodigal son and God and or the father, in this case, Jesus playing the father, going out and with open arms, welcoming back the prodigal son, those who have been lost, those who
Hmm.
need to be cleansed. But then at the end, the father's, the son's back. We're going to hold a big feast. And so then Jesus gets questioned about fasting in verses 33 through 39.
Yeah.
And Jesus is like, why am I going to fast? We're here to have a feast, right? And fasting uh, in the Israelite society, based on Old Testament commands, was about they're lamenting disasters like the destruction of the temple, but the feast is about commemorating celebrating successes and good times, like the rededication of the temple. And so when Jesus is saying, "I'm here," the presence of God is in your midst, and you want to fast. What does that say about you, and what does that say about how you see my presence? So no, we're here to feast because the time of fasting will come, alluding to his crucifixion and death. But now we're here to feast.
Yeah, good. Yeah, the fasting, I hadn't thought about that. The fasting tied to the lament, the banquet definitely tied to the celebration. And right now is the time to celebrate. Messiah is here, incarnation, right? Did you have something, Amber, you were going to say?
I have one last thing so you can wrap it up.
Good.
I just made a note that starting right here, basically at the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5, we know this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry here. I wanted to ask everyone that's listening to maybe begin to notice, pay attention, maybe even make a note or even underline like I do. I have lots of notes in my Bible. If you don't do that, figure out another way to make notes. I picked a color and I started coloring and underlining every different kind of place that Jesus preaches from. The different pulpits, if you will, he's preaching from. And it's kind of really fascinating. Already you have synagogues, you have a boat. When he sat down and started talking, that was him. It was traditional for a rabbi to sit down and teach his people. That was him teaching, that was him preaching. So in a boat, you have in a house. You have them all different places. So already in one chapter, we have multiple places. So start paying attention, start noticing, and just start getting your mind wrapped around all the different ways that where Jesus is preaching.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's
Mm.
wonderful. And here at the very end, it's basically Jesus saying he does about old wineskin, new wine, and it'll burst. And so he's really already pushing this envelope with the Pharisees and the Sadducees in particular. This new thing is happening, and Jesus wants us to see something new has happened. The Apostle Paul puts it this way: in Christ Jesus, you are a new creation. The old has passed, the new has come. Jesus is bringing something new, and this is why there is this reaction against it. There always is when it's something new, right? But he's bringing a new law, a new life to the world, and he wants us to see that. He wants us to know that. And all of these things are just signs. The miracles, they're just signs pointing to the Jesus, the divine Son who has arrived. So, guys, this week it's a great week. I hope y'all can dig down into these scriptures. Ask God to speak to you. He's gonna give you even things that we didn't cover. There's no way we can cover everything. He's gonna give it to you, and he's gonna just bless you this week. So I pray that God will bless you as you study His Word as we do this together. And until we see you again, God bless you.
Bye.